And we are joined in the studio with Mr. Nate Schutta, architect as a service, adjunct professor, and general all around good guy. Nate, how are you?
I'm doing all right. This has been the week of technical glitches for me. I don't know why. Was doing a presentation for APJ earlier this week and took forever to get logged in. And then once we got logged in, I think about 25 minutes in, my internet provider decided that 2:30 in the morning is the perfect time to be doing network maintenance because my internet connection kept going on and off. And
I
yeah,
mean,
it's good times.
in general, it's probably not a bad time, but I don't know. I think 2020 is the year of technical glitches. That the mantra for the year is, can everybody see my screen? Can you
Right.
hear me?
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
But maybe what will come out of all of this is we will finally have a reliable and resilient video conferencing software. But
Maybe,
maybe.
maybe. I don't know.
Okay, great. We got a comment there where they can hear both of us. But let's dive right into this topic because I love this topic, and this is a drum that I beat almost daily in my day job about microservices. In fact, I started off an argument
Oh,
a while
excellent.
back. I was on Teams, and I think that's why everybody was already in a little bit of a bad mood. And I mentioned that I just said we were talking about microservice design, and I said, I'm not even convinced that microservices or a microservice architecture is right for this project.
Right.
And it was like a needle scratched across a room. Everybody sort of turned around and looked at me cockeyed and what?
How
Why
dare
would you
you,
use
sir?
anything else? And that kind of started a very big dialogue. But let's talk about this. First of all, what do you mean when you say responsible microservices?
Yeah, that's great. So let me sling a few slides here and see what kind of trouble that gets us into. And then, I think at a couple points here, I'll just stop and you and I can chat because I think that will be interesting, based on the conversation you and I had earlier this week. Because what you're talking about, this argument, is exactly what I'm trying to drive at with this. We need to be responsible with microservices. And I actually did take the time to turn this into an ebook. So this material grew out of actually a client engagement that Matt Stein and I had a couple years back, where we were in this windowless conference room, and the client's going in position was, well, everything has to be a microservice, and so we had to kind of talk them off that ledge. And so I turned that into a blog post, a series of blog posts, and then eventually into this talk, and then also then into this ebook, because I felt it'd be nice to have one combined place to go get this material. But the moral of the story is, for a lot of us, we get into this cloud space and we realize, gosh, there's a lot of options here. And unfortunately, for a lot of developers, they look at the cloud and they say, well, obviously I have to do microservices. And so we spend all this time talking about domain driven design and bounded contexts, and looking for these ubiquitous language things, and running around forming these amazing two pizza teams that, to paraphrase my favorite sort of chaos mathematician fictional character, your developers were so preoccupied with whether they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. And that's leading to pain. You're already starting to see this backlash with macro services and right size services. And wow, it's actually really hard to maintain these environments with hundreds or thousands of services. My call tree looks like this. And we're all like, geez, maybe that wasn't such a great idea. Now, what I've been trying to get across in this material is there are a lot of good reasons to adopt microservice architecture, but none of this comes for free. And we have to understand that there is added complexity that comes along with that ride. And we have to ask ourselves, are we actually getting a benefit from that? Or have I just made things harder than they need to be? I was thinking about this. You back when we used to leave our homes and you would go to this thing called a gym where you would work out with other people. You'd always see that one person who needed to put like the weight vest on to do pull-ups because they were so strong, their own body weight wasn't hard enough. I just think, yeah, that's never going to be me. But we don't need to make software any harder than it already is. The domains we work in are complicated, and there's just this massive disruption, and we're having to move faster and faster and faster. You don't need to make this any harder than it has to be. And so really what I try to get across with this is, when should we use microservices? And again, I sort of colloquially refer to this as responsible microservices. But so how did your argument go, Michael? I mean, I'm curious, what sort of the counter argument was. Why did we need microservices in that particular instance? And what was the back and forth like for you?
Sorry, it was my turn to get off of mute here. Yeah, so honestly, what ultimately ended up happening there is I gave a presentation to the team talking about a number of different architecture requirements and how we would end up choosing one of those. That yeah, we could do microservices and here's what we get and here's what it costs us, or we could do an event-driven architecture. Here's what we get and here's what it costs
Right.
us. Because what is the answer in software architecture? Universally,
It depends.
it depends exactly. And honestly, here's one that came up for me was this idea of domain to architecture isomorphism.
Okay.
In other words, does the shape of the problem you're trying to solve kind of fit? Does it match that architecture shape? And one of the things that we saw was there was a great deal of workflow type stuff in the back end of the system. And so if we were to build this with microservices, we were going to get a call tree that looks exactly like
Right.
that one you popped up on the slide. You know, it's just one of those things that microservices aren't good at. Can we do workflow with microservices? Sure. In fact, we do all the time. And we end up with a big ball of yarn. Just
Right.
just a big knot of calls and cascading failures and things like that. Which actually leads me to a question that I'd like to ask you.
All right.
So obviously, we break everything apart in a microservice architecture, and then at some point we've got to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. When we do, as we start kind of, we've got this bounded context and that bounded context, and we've identified all these domains and broke things down to this nice kind of optimum level of granularity. When we start putting things back together, inevitably we have to start calling out to other microservices, right? If you're making an order, you've got to go get the customer data, you've got to get inventory and things like that. What are your thoughts on trying to rein that in and keep that from turning into a whole bunch of sequential calls that add latency with every hop and add another point of failure at every hop?
Wait, you mean that the speed of light is still really a thing? It's a constraint for us. We have to worry about that. I mean, now
I
you're going to tell
mean,
me I have to put my data close to my business services too. Otherwise, again, I'm adding latency. Yeah.
well, I mean, we could always, yeah, I think we're still dealing with that constant there.
Yeah.
I think we can
Unfortunately.
slow the speed of light down, which is exciting, but we haven't figured out how to speed it up yet.
Well, it's the same argument I see around serverless, frankly. So I very distinctly remember I was sitting in this event. Dave Sire was giving a presentation on serverless, and he was showing some of the research he's done on just how fast Java actually can be. There is this feeling in some corners of the internet that Java is too slow for these sort of modern architectures, certainly for serverless, which I think is demonstrably false. And the thing that occurred to me as Dave was giving this presentation is if I, as the architect, chose serverless in a situation where that latency, that cold startup penalty affects my end user, I made a bad architectural choice. It isn't, it doesn't have anything to do with serverless, doesn't have anything to do with Java, the language choice. I made a bad choice from an architectural standpoint. And one of my, I guess, sort of soapbox rants is just being responsible for the tool choices that we make. The analogy I like to use, we finished our basement a couple of years ago. And of course, I'm a software person, so I don't know anything about hardware. I have one hammer in my toolbox, and that's more than sufficient for me to screw up anything around the house. So when we got to this point where we decided we're going to finish the basement, well, we hired the job out. I wanted this done in my lifetime, and I wanted it to look good. And so when the folks came to do the work, they didn't show up with the one hammer like I have in my toolbox. They had a truck full of hammers. And in fact, they even had different specialists to do different parts of the job. Now, some of that's obvious. You're going to bring a plumber in to do plumbing. You're going to bring an electrician in to do the wiring. But my general contractor told me one day, he said, "Oh, yeah, the guy I use for framing is great at framing. He's horrible at finish work. So I don't let him do finish work. I just use him for framing." And I thought that's where we need to kind of be with software, technology, any of these choices. There are good reasons to use any of these things, it's on us to know, okay, well, when should I reach for microservices? When should I reach for serverless? When should I have a modular monolith? And just understand that it's on us to make a responsible choice there. And we really have to get out of this sort of mindset of resume driven design where I want to play with this, I want to put this on my resume, so that's my excuse for wanting to use microservices or serverless, et cetera. So I do think it's on us to understand the implications, the trade-offs. If I'm adding this latency in such a way that it can be felt by my customer, well, I might need to rethink that approach. And we also need to understand what is it that we actually need to deliver. I had this conversation, I want to say it was in Columbus at the No Fluff event 2 years ago. And this gentleman came up to me and he said, "Hey, I'm getting a lot of pressure from my management chain to put everything in the cloud. What do I do about this?" And then he proceeded to tell me more about his application. It was like an auction site. They had, as I recall, a contractual SLA. I guess that's kind of a duplicate phrase there. That's SLA means you have some kind of a contract in place, but they had to deliver bid updates in like 42 milliseconds or something to that effect. And this was a hard requirement. Now they had done a tremendous amount of engineering work to get that accomplished. And so his question is, "Oh, can I get that in the cloud?" And I'm like, "Probably, but you might pay a lot to do it. And you might have to work directly with your cloud provider to make that happen." And his question to me is really like, "How am I supposed to handle my management on this?" And I said, "Well, first and foremost, give them the data, give them the numbers. So can we even do this? If so, how much is it going to cost? And then let them make the decision. Are you willing to pay that price or not? Are you comfortable with the approach you have or not? And then more importantly, take a step back and look at, are there parts of your application that actually would make sense in the cloud in this sort of distributed approach?" And then maybe you can move that and then you give them the win. They get to say, "Cool, I helped, or I was the one who instigated this move to the cloud." And now they can put that on their bonus sheet, so to speak. And so you have to kind of look at it that way. And so again, I long answer short, we have to look at those trade-offs and ask ourselves, is this really the best approach for what we're trying to accomplish or not? Let's see, Michael's muted again. We're having all sorts of see, it's the week of technical problems, Michael.
I don't know why we tried to. We shouldn't even had the webinar this week. This is probably the worst week of the year to possibly do that. But no. What I was saying was that actually I forgot entirely what I was saying now.
Probably
But
something along the lines of, "You're so smart, Nate. Thank you for your wisdom." Maybe, I don't know.
that was the gist of it, I
Yeah,
think.
probably.
And that is true. But going back to a webinar that we had a couple weeks ago or a couple months ago, I don't know. Time has lost all meaning in 2020.
Right.
But we had Rod Cope on here, and he threw out an interesting statistic, and that was that 90% of microservice implementations will fail. Now, I want to be clear, and that was not his stat. It was from Gartner, I think, or IDC, or one of these companies. But I want to be clear on what failure means in this context. In this case, it was okay. We got to start putting these things back together, and they ended up with some sort of hybrid approach, and it kind of moving. We put everything in the microservices, and then we kind of retreated from that position and kind of went towards a service-based architecture. But I want to. We got a chat in here, by the way, really quickly from
Yeah.
Dan. It says, "Could you two define what a microservice is?" I feel like I could ask two different people at my company and get two different answers. I'm poised to give an answer different to yours.
Yeah.
Maybe
Well,
that's
let me cover that, and then I'll pause again, and then you can tell me why my approach is wrong, and we can argue about that. How's that sound?
that sounds great. Although to be fair, I'll probably accidentally be on mute.
That's probably fine. I'll just go on mute, and then it'll be fair, right? All right, let me try this again and see what happens. Because the great irony is, I think actually my next set of slides is exactly that. What is a microservice? And how do we define these things? And I would argue ultimately it's just a reaction to the monolith and these heavyweight SOA-y things that we did just a few short years ago. I mean, we see this constantly in our industry where we reinvent something that we just did and we give it a new name, pretend no one's ever done anything like this ever before. And I could go on and on and on with examples, just to kind of put this into your mind. Remember EJBs when we all did EJBs? And, if you kind of look at it really closely, EJBs is just another implementation idea of Corba, so this is what we do time and time again. Now, I also think it is a acknowledgement of what the cloud gives us as well, and sort of the blending or blurring of those two concepts. Now, let's be fair, the monolith isn't a lot of fun, although it doesn't have to be that way. You can have well-structured monoliths that actually are relatively benign places for us to exist. And we always tend to give them paint with this broad brush. But developer productivity tends to not be great on these ginormous code bases. It's really hard for a developer to get their head wrapped around these millions in many cases lines of code. It takes a long time to get ramped up. I worked at one org where I think the expectation was you needed to be there about a year before you could be productive. And of course, we ask ourselves, why have we traditionally done these quarterly releases? Well, we wanted to wait until we had everything kind of batched together. We had to push the whole thing anyway. So we might as well have enough there to justify the pain of going to production. And scaling was a pain. I had to scale the whole thing. I couldn't just scale the part that needed it. And we all understand how hard these systems were to evolve. And some of that's actually just due to the second law of thermodynamics, or as I like to refer to it as the teenager's bedroom. I am the proud owner of a teenager, and I think he's upstairs at school, so to speak, these days. But his bedroom is a little messy. At some point during pandemic times here, I was putting something in his room or taking something out of his room, and I had a hard time figuring out where the floor was. And so I said to my wife, hey, maybe we should ask the kiddo to clean his room. And she looked at me and said, what hill do you want to die on today? And I realized it wasn't that one. Now, as much as I wish my son's room was more organized, heck, I wish my office was more organized. And you can see some of the clutter behind my shoulders. The universe wants to be disordered. And you know what? Software is not immune from these particular forces. Every one of us has started on a project and uttered some variant of, this time we're going to do it right, only to some number of months later be tearing our hair out going, what happened? We've crossed the streams. This isn't working anywhere near as well as it was before. And of course, over time, it takes longer and longer to add new functionality. And this has ultimately given birth to this new architectural style known as the microservice. Now, to our wonderful commenter's question, there is no one definition. This is the very embodiment of you'll know it when you see it. It's in the eye of the beholder, which leads to one of my all-time favorite tweets. This is my former boss, Andrew Clay Schaefer, who wants to argue about the definitions of made-up words with me. This is another thing we love to do in this industry, get into these very pedantic arguments about terminology. Now, I'm rather partial to this concept of anything that can be rewritten in 2 weeks or less, because that reminds us these things are supposed to be small. They're not supposed to be huge. If I made a mistake, I lost an iteration, I can probably recover from an iteration. And we can frankly debate how big is big, how small is small till the cows come home. I strongly urge you to watch Sam's video from earlier this year where he talks about this. How big should a microservice be? It's 8 minutes of your time well worth it. And Sam's point ultimately is they'll get smaller over time because you get better at it and you get better at deploying them, maintaining them, building them, etc. Now, you see, some people will focus on the two pizza team concept. And I struggle with this definition for multiple reasons. I mean, first and foremost, how hungry is the team? How big is the pizza? There's more variables here than just two pizzas per team. But the other problem I have with the two pizza concept is it doesn't give me any guidance for how many services my two pizza team can handle. So if these services are very stable, my two pizza team might be able to handle 10, 15, 20. If these services are really volatile and they're changing all the time, that exact same group of developers might only be able to handle 3. And so it's important for us to move beyond kind of these simplistic sort of things and think more in terms of characteristics. These are ultimately suites of small, focused services. They do one thing, they do it well. Sort of think that Linux, Unix-like concept where we pipe simple things together to get more complicated results. They should be independently deployable. This actually gets violated fairly regularly. A friend of mine was telling me that he was at an organization where they were trying to do microservices and they didn't quite get this part right. They had these set of services, I think it was 7 of them, that if you touched any one of the 7, you had to deploy all 7. And just to make life more interesting, you had to deploy them in the proper order, or else the databases wouldn't spin up properly. But we can independently scale them. We can evolve them at different rates. It does give us as developers the freedom to choose the tech that we need for that job. Although frankly, this one gets abused a lot. Instead of looking at it and saying, oh, this problem would benefit from this language or this database, we kind of go the other way, which is, oh, thank God, I have been looking for a justification to use this esoteric language here. Microservices finally gives me that excuse. Ultimately, these things should be built around business capabilities. And it's really just an instance of what I refer to as the zeroth law of computer science, which is high cohesion, low coupling. If you take a step back from almost every pattern that we use in software, it's some variant of high cohesion, low coupling, just at different levels of abstraction. And I would argue that microservices are essentially high cohesion, low coupling applied to services. Now, ultimately, it's an approach, it's a style, it's a pattern. It is not Mjolnir. It is not going to solve every problem you've ever had in every project, despite the way many of us have pitched it. And as I was saying earlier, Michael, it's just a tool. And it's on us to know when to use which tool, when to grab which tool, and to understand how useful that tool can be in the right place. For example, earlier this week, I bought a new indoor trainer for my bike because it's winter here in Minnesota. We're rapidly approaching winter, and so outdoor riding is going to become fewer and farther in between. And so to continue to get on my bike, I got a new trainer. Actually, I got the other one so my wife could also put up her bike on the trainer so she could continue doing stuff. And I had to change the cassette on the trainer. And I've never done this before, but there's a YouTube video. So as long as there's a video, I might be able to pull it off. But it required me to get a couple of very specialized tools. And so I went to my local bike shop and I got a new cassette and I got those tools. And admittedly, I like buying a new tool, but they're pretty much going to sit in my bike toolbox because I'm probably never going to have to do that again. But I couldn't have done the job without those tools. So it's on us to know when to pick up which tool and just realize that, hey, if you can't handle a microservice, you might just have to stay with the monolith. Simon has different variants on this. There's one that's like, you must be this tall to ride, and he's absolutely right. But I think it's important to understand that, this concept of sort of modularity, and if you'll indulge me, my abuse of the English language, distributability, and you can be at different places on this particular scale. And so the big ball of mud is sort of the worst of both, right? You can't really distribute it. It's not modular at all. And so as developers, we recognize how that's not a great approach. And so we look at microservices and we're like, oh, there we go. That's the answer. That's nirvana. And we attempt to take these big balls of mud and go straight to microservices. Well, unfortunately, that's usually not what happens. What typically happens is we build a distributed big ball of mud. And this is the worst possible architecture for us to choose, because now I've got all the drawbacks of both and I get none of the benefits of either. And so this is just not the place to be, but this is what we typically create as we try to move this big ball of mud to microservices. It's clear in many instances, our best bet is to migrate, refactor opportunistically to a modular monolith. And then from there, where it makes sense, migrate to microservices, understanding that it can certainly be a mix. There's no rule that says it's all or none. We get in these debates in technology that seem so focused on ors. It's either Angular or React. It's either Java or C# or whatever it happens to be. So many times it's not an or conversation. It's an and conversation. And it's on us as senior technologist, architect, lead engineer, principal engineer, tech lead, whatever your title is, to be able to understand when to use which one. Now, there is additional chatter today around these sort of macro services, right-size services. And so some people will take their modular monolith and go more towards that. And others will say, okay, I'm going to take my microservices and refactor them to these more macro approaches. It's all up to us. What's going to solve the problem in front of us? Understanding that in many instances, modular monolith is probably our best bet.
And do you want to define that for anybody who's not heard that particular term of art?
Yeah. So again, the idea here, we always look at monoliths as being negative, but they don't have to be. We can actually have a well-factored monolith that allows me to sort of break things up, to move components around. So again, these don't have to be either or conversations. It's on us to kind of figure out where the best application is. One of my colleagues, he and I were talking about this earlier this year, and he brought up a great point about microservices. He says they can help us solve some of these technical issues. So he was using this particularly in terms of credit card compliance, the rules and regulations around that, how we have to store it. He said it's a heck of a lot easier to do that with 1 or 3 or 5 microservices than attempt to refactor your entire monolith to take advantage of that, or to be, PCI compliant or whatever the regulation is in your part of the world. Again, we can create a monolith that's well layered, well structured, and easy to work in. There is no dictate that says we have to cross the streams and make it hard on ourselves. There is a middle ground. It takes engineering discipline, and it takes us kind of staying on top of the technical debt, but it is doable.
And one of the other things I wanted to get you to go into a little bit is, if we are going the route of microservices, what is that optimal granularity? I already know the answer to that question, but this is one of those questions that comes up a lot.
Right.
That, okay, how granular should I make these? And I think one of the mistakes that I see is teams often make their microservices too granular.
Mm-hmm.
What are your tips on right sizing that those microservice size, scope, granularity, and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, you know what I'm going to say is it depends, right? And the challenge we run into is, so you and I used to spend a lot of time on airplanes. Obviously we haven't done as much of that as we normally would at this point in the calendar year. But every time I walk past the cockpit, I look at all the buttons and levers and dials and gauges, and I just go, wow, that's really complicated. Now, that's because I don't know anything about how to fly an airplane. I've never studied any of that. I have no idea what any of that stuff does. And so to me, that looks overwhelming. Now you take our friend Ken Sipe, who, has this private pilot's license, and he looks at that and says, well, how could you make it any simpler? This is as simple as you can make it and have it still work. And so I think we need to take a similar sort of stance there, which is, yes, fine grained is good, but you can also be too fine grained. And so that's going to take us time to find. It's going to vary from application to application. And we should be willing and able to combine things together when it turns out they're too fine grained, break things apart when it turns out they're too coarse grained, and just expect that that's naturally going to evolve over time. One of the arguments in favor of sort of a modular monolith, or, if you want to call it a well-structured monolith, is that it helps us find those seams and helps us figure out where those bounded contexts actually live. And it might actually be easier to do that first, as opposed to trying to a priori imagine, oh, okay, what are the services the system might need? So sometimes that actually, it makes our job easier to sort of flow through that pattern, as opposed to go directly to microservices. We tend to get that granularity off, I would say, more when we try to jump immediately in there from the beginning. I think you're muted again, Michael. See, seriously, dude, this is the week of technical difficulty.
This is supposed to happen automatically every time I switch back to this view, but whatever. I think I can press a button. I'll make sure that happens from now on. So we got an interesting question coming up in the chat right now, and the question basically revolves around event-driven architectures and microservices, and are the two mutually exclusive? And I see a hybrid emerge a lot.
Yeah.
But beyond that, what are your thoughts in around asynchronous communication patterns in microservice architectures today? Because I've seen that, for example, our friend Mark Richards wrote in, and Neil Ford wrote in Fundamentals of Software Architecture that your default should be synchronous communication in your microservices.
This book right here that I have sitting right next to me. Yes, exactly.
Oh wait, this book?
Do we get a quarter or something for plugging their stuff? I don't know. Maybe they'll buy us a scotch. That's actually worth more. So
yeah. So, but yeah, in that book, Mark and Neil state that by default your communication in microservice should be synchronous, and asynchronous is the exception. And I've increasingly become of the opinion that you want to try for asynchronous. because not everything. There are a lot more events than requests in inter-service communication than we like to think. Uh, and I hate to kick against the gods, but what are your thoughts there?
Well, again, it depends, right? And I think both Mark and Neil would echo that same sentiment that certainly they have trade-offs, they have pros and cons, and it's on us to know which makes sense where. I think about this a lot with serverless. To me, one of the best uses of serverless is when I have that asynchronous sort of thing where it doesn't really matter when this completes. So think about any account you have anywhere. If you update your address or your password, you get notified of that. Whether that's your text message or an email or something, and it doesn't really matter whether you get that immediately, 10 seconds
Mm-hmm.
later, a minute later. So that doesn't much matter. Like I just bought something online yesterday and I kept like refreshing my email, waiting for the email confirmation before I closed the window that had like my order number in it. And then I'm like, why am I hitting refresh? Like, it'll get here. I know it'll get here. You just have to be patient. That's a perfect asynchronous thing. It doesn't really matter as long as it happens within a reasonable amount of time. And boy, we could debate that with our customers till the cows come home.
Sure.
So to me, that's where we really have to look at it. Now, there are definitely instances where it better be synchronous, or we probably have some issues. I could see things around inventory updating where I sold it to you and I sold it to someone else, but it turns out I actually only had one in stock. But in
Mm-hmm.
between the time I said it was here and then it was gone, that's going to make for an unhappy customer experience. So it depends so much on the domains. It depends so much on what specifically we're trying to do within that. I'm very much of the opinion as technologists, we need to be ruthlessly pragmatic, and dogma in frankly any of its forms is dangerous,
Mm.
whether that's dogma around agile or dogma around languages, technologies, et cetera. It never works out well for us. So that's where I just say we have to take a step back and ask ourselves what makes sense here. What's the right thing for us to do in this instance, as opposed to relying on, set of recipes. Well, I just always do it this way. Well, that's not always the right thing to do. I mean, you and I live in a place where it snows. And so
Mm-hmm.
the main highway, when there's no snow on the ground, fly along at 70, 75 miles an hour, whatever, you don't think twice about it. Well, you don't do that when it's snowing. You don't do that in a blizzard. You don't do that when the road's covered in ice. I mean, if you do, you're going to get an accident, right? So you don't just have this, well, the speed limit's 70, so I do 75 regardless. You got to be aware of the conditions.
Hmm. Well, and actually, to your point, you brought up an example that I bring up a lot as well in defense of event-driven architectures. Uh, Basically, challenging people to think about, is this an event or is this a request?
Right.
And I always bring up because the for whatever reason in sort of reactive front ends, we always build to-do lists, and when we talk about microservices, we always talk about e-commerce, even though there are radically different problem domains than that.
I've
And
never once built an e-commerce site.
oh, good. I have built Vue and React and Angular to do apps and Hacker News clones as well, but I think we've reached peak both of those. But we talk about this, and it's like, well, the checkout is a request, and I need to check inventory, and I need to do that transaction, and I need to do this, and my response is always, do you?
Right.
I mean, if you do, then you do, but do you? Because these things are not technical requirements, they're business requirements. And you brought up flying, and
Hmm.
we've had this happen. We've booked a flight, got to the gate, and they're like, oh, whoops,
Yep.
we sold some seats that we don't have.
Yep.
Anybody want to get a later flight?
Yep.
And so it turns out that the business can tolerate those issues when they come up.
Right.
That and so if an airline can oversell a flight, and they routinely do, and I believe Amazon as well. In fact, I think somebody commented, Ed in the chat said, when you said, "Oh, you don't want to sell this to me and to you," and there was unless you're Amazon, because it turns out that checkout is an event, and as part of that event process, it's going to say, "Oh, let's get the oh," and then they fire off an email to you
Right.
that says, "Whoops, our bad. Somebody just beat you to it." And
Well,
So,
and that's where we then have to have that conversation with our business partners as to what
mhm.
can they tolerate and what is reasonable and what isn't, and of course factoring in sort of reputation cost. So this was about a month ago or so. I ordered something and I couldn't expedite the shipping, and so I called them and I'm like, I need to expedite this, and they're like, oh, sorry, that particular product doesn't have expedited shipping, and I'm thinking, seriously, you're telling me that UPS, FedEx, DHL, they won't let me give them money to get it here faster? I'm pretty confident they all have multiple routes, but okay, fine. And I said, listen, if this doesn't get to me by this date, it's not useful to me. Like, I will
Mm,
send it back to you. And they're like, oh no, it says it'll get there on this date. That's the latest it can get there. Well, it came a day later than I needed it. So
yep.
I have the return label sitting to my right. It will be going off to be returned to them. And this wasn't a cheap thing either, you know? And so it's like, you now we're going to get this product back. I'm going to get my money back. And I might think twice about ordering from you then in the future if you can't get me the thing you said you're going to get me in time. And so that's where we have to understand the impact of that and the ramifications of that, and you know how that then how we view that company moving forward. We can put a dollar amount on that. You know, it might be a bit of a swag, but we can at least have that conversation so that we fully understand again the implications of what we're trying to do from a technical perspective.
Well, I want to bring up one other comment on the event-driven microservice duality or schism or whatever else. A lot of times we have clearly defined domains, and then we have these cross-cutting domains like customer or user or what have you, where you kind of just need to touch the customer microservice almost everywhere.
Right.
And as a result, you've created that hard dependency. Those two are for better or for worse tightly coupled, and you run into these issues of, well, I'm changing the customer microservice and I'm breaking the API, which means I need to also deploy all these other things. Um, which is a smell, I think, in a microservice architecture, and I want to come back to that. But talking to a lot of the event driven folks at Confluent that are behind Apache Kafka, that they're like, well, you just need to know when those things change. So why don't you just every time somebody updates the customer, you just post that update to a topic, and all your microservices that need customer information can subscribe to that topic and keep their own cache of customer data in sync. And and that starts to sound like a hybrid architecture to me, because my customer changed, emit an event, and all my other services listen for it. But it seems like a lot of problems go away. Like, I can use schema registry, and I know that if my old microservice is expecting a serialization that looks like this, and my new microservice, my customer microservice, is giving a new serialization that looks like that, that it can that can either keep that check to make sure it's backwards compatible, or even downgrade the message that I published so that my subscriber can get it in the format that it wants. And suddenly a lot of these deployability problems go away and things like that. I guess, where do you see these two evolving? Because I thought that was an interesting question in event driven and microservices. I see the two converging, but I want to know your thoughts.
No, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And same, frankly, for what Mark would call kind of the service-based approach. It's finding that Goldilocks. And what I see so often in this industry, and this is repeated enough that I think it's just about inevitable. A new thing comes along, and we all get so excited about it that we start using it in places that it doesn't make sense. I remember when NoSQL databases first came out, people were using them all over the place. And it's like, wait, take a step back. Are you sure a NoSQL database is the right choice for this particular problem? We see it today with microservices and serverless, where we go so far in the other direction in an effort to figure out where it works and where it doesn't. And ultimately, this is really just how we learn. I mean, we learn through trial and error. My son is 13, and one day, I can't remember if this was this year or last year, because time has no meaning anymore. There was a last week at one point, I'm like, wait, what day is it? I mean, it's just my brain has no real concept of time these days. But he was complaining about math or something. And I said, listen, dude, if you already knew how to do that, we would just give you harder things to do. We would just keep pushing you until we found your breaking point. That's learning. And so I think we take that same approach when it comes to new technology. These things tend to get created to solve a specific problem, to scratch a certain itch. And the initial reports about it are generally glowing because they're being used in the situation they were designed for, to scratch those specific itches. And so let's say we're doing demo on your house, we're going to remodel your kitchen. And so we're going to tear out all the cabinets. We might use a sledgehammer for that. Well, if that's our first exposure to a hammer is demo, and we're like, oh my God, sledgehammers were so good for demo, I'm going to use a sledgehammer for everything. We're going to hurt ourselves, and we're going to hurt the thing we're trying to do by trying to use a sledgehammer to, put up some nice finish trim or something, right? And so it's the same thing with microservices, NoSQL databases, time series databases, whatever it happens to be. We get so infatuated with it that we inevitably use it in a place it was never designed for, and then it fails predictably. And we have this tendency to blame the tool, the technology, the language, instead of saying, maybe I made a bad choice as the architect on that project. Now, I don't know that there's a way to shortcut that, to be honest with you. I mean, I do feel like sometimes that's the only way we learn, is by failing. So we just need to be able to accept that when these things are new, there's a lot of dragons out there. We don't know where the edges of the map are yet. And then once we find those edges, we need to take a step back and realize, oh, okay, here's where this makes sense. Here's where this is a good fit. Here's where this other thing is a better fit. And actually, you know what? If I put these two things together, it's like chocolate and peanut butter, assuming you don't have a nut allergy, at least.
And there's a comment in here as well from Aaron saying, knowing the answer is it depends, and that there are a lot of factors that would drive this decision. If you were to take on a brand new application, would you tend to prefer microservices approach or the modular monolith? First, I think I would challenge the implicit assumption in that question that those are the only two options.
Right.
There are many architectural styles. And just to go back to plug Mark and Nate's book again, they do go through several of them, and they're, the big question, the real kind of dichotomy there, the true dichotomy is monolith or distributed. And then when you make that decision, there are factors that go into that. But once you make that decision, then there's a myriad of distributed architectures, including microservices. There's a myriad of monolithic architectures, including modular monoliths. And but the question here is then, assuming the real question is monolithic or distributed architecture, and whatever that means, what are some of the things that you would put into that decision process?
Sure.
Certainly, I know I think about team maturity and skills, because I happen, in my experience, microservices are one of the hardest things to build for a number of reasons. But I don't know. I want you to take that.
No, I think that's a great place to start, really, is your team's abilities. There's no point in us overwhelming our teams with something they can't build. It's on us as architects to try to position our teams to be successful. I remember years ago, I had made a decision on a JavaScript library. We had this one project that went off and did what I refer to as a vision quest. They kind of remove all the shackles. What's the perfect user interface? What would we want? What do our customers want? And they came back with this very cool thing, but it had a lot of gaps in our sort of code base. There's a lot of things we couldn't do, a lot of interesting UI moments that we just had no answer for. And so I spent a few days kind of surveying the field, trying to figure out what JavaScript libraries can kind of fill this gap for us. And I ended up picking one and kind of defining my decisions. And my manager said, hey, love what you did, agree with your decision. This is absolutely correct on how you sort of laid this out, and I agree with your conclusions. But he said, here's the thing. I'm not going to rate you this year based on you making that decision. That's the easy part. You need to make your team successful with that. So the way I'm going to rate you for this year is your ability to enable your teams to succeed with the choice that you made. And so I'd argue it's the same really for us when it comes to these architectural decisions around distributed or not, modular, monolith, or microservices or serverless. And again, I think the answer is rarely or. It's almost always an and it's this interesting hybrid mix of, well, I'm going to use a few of these and a little bit of that and a dash of this, and that's going to help me solve these problems. Again, knowing that it's more complicated than simply, well, I really love this approach, so I'm going to take it. We have to factor in not just our development team's maturity, But what about our operations side of the house? Do we have the ability to get code to production rapidly, repeatably? Do we have the infrastructure in place to support these architectures? Microservices conceptually are something we could have done 20 years ago, 15 years ago. But just think about the conversation you would have had to have with your operations people.
Oof.
Listen, I'm going to need, a couple thousand instances of the app server spun up in every region. Their heads would have exploded. They'd be like, get out of my office. You don't get to build software anymore. And then that's after the CFO came over and said, you want to spend how much with our app server vendor of choice? So we have to realize that all these decisions exist in a larger universe, and it isn't just us saying, well, I was successful on this project with this, or I want to try this, or I think this is the answer because I read a white paper about how company X succeeded with it. We have to look at our own situation and what makes sense for us. And I realize that's a lot harder than just saying this is the answer, but that's software, that's architecture. If there was just one answer, this job wouldn't be as interesting, and frankly, they wouldn't need as many of us, right? So I guess it's kind of in our best interest that this stuff can be hard.
And I don't want to go too far on a tangent here, but one of the questions that also came up, and I think this is a question that uh, is not as uncommon as it might seem, is what is a modular monolith? That I don't think that's a very widely used term of art. I know we talk about this and we hang around people who write entire chapters of a book about this stuff. But can you
Well, I
Cliff
mean,
Notes summarize that?
we did talk about this earlier, but I think maybe another way to think about it is a well-structured monolith. We always have these sort of negative experiences with bad code bases, and then we just sort of ascribe that to the architecture or the language or the database. And it's usually something that we screwed up. It's something where we crossed the streams. We did something that we knew we shouldn't have done, and some of that's just that it takes a while to think in a language. I remember being on one project where I was helping a former COBOL programmer write Java. And, he was giving it the college try, and, he certainly could understand the grammar of the language fairly easily, but he really struggled thinking in a Java way, in an OO way. And I very distinctly remember having this conversation with him one day where he said, I just don't like Java. I have to go to all these different files every time I want to make a change. He said, with COBOL, I just went one place. I thought, okay, I hear where you're coming from. So it's understanding that I can build a quote unquote monolithic code base that actually has some of the attributes that we get from microservices. Not all of them, mind you, but I can get some of the benefits. And it can still be code that's well factored. It can be code that's easy to modify. I can have good code coverage with unit tests, and we can have some linting tools in place that make sure we're not making sort of simple mistakes, the blocking and tackling sort of mistakes. So that's the way I look at it. Maybe better to think of it as like a well-structured monolith, or one that does allow me to break the pieces up and potentially run them on different compute if I need to. But again, none of these are really or decisions in my experience. So many of these are and decisions. It's kind of getting people out of that mindset that it's this or that. It's like, well, why can't it be both? And I think that's again where we need to provide a certain level of technical maturity to these conversations to say, this is what makes sense in this instance, and that might not be the same thing that makes sense in another instance. And and that can be hard, right? That's a challenge for many of us, because we sort of naturally want those quick and easy decisions, right? I mean, we see it every year. We're kind of hidden into the holidays, and so now they're going to start seeing all those ads for weight loss and get yourself fit again. And we all want like this magic pill that we can take, or somebody please just give me the one exercise that will give me a six-pack in 5 minutes a day or something. It takes time. We all know what it takes. You got to work out more, eat less, less of the stuff that's not good for you, more of the stuff that's good for you, more broccoli, more kale, less donuts. Man, the donut tastes good. And I contend, by the way, donuts are a recovery food. That may not be popular in the nutrition sequence, but donuts have their place.
And I'm all for that. And I think my wife, who's also an avid cyclist, she says eat big to ride big.
Dang tootin'.
But one way that I heard the modular monolith described that I liked, it resonated with me. So I'll share it, is that typically when we think of a monolith, we think of a layered monolith, right? Where we've got our UI, and then we've got our services and our business logic, and then a repository. And right, we have these horizontal layers that are grouped by technical domain. And that, as it was explained to me, that instead of slicing these horizontally, we're slicing these vertically now. So instead of every slice being, well, this is the UI, and this is the business services, and this is the repository, we slice these vertically by the domain. So we
Sure.
do a domain driven design exercise and be like, okay, this is the orders domain, and you have one package or one assembly that satisfies that, as though it was a distributed service, but it just happens to be compiled into one deployable. And that way you've got a lot more modularity, and you can make changes. The scope of your changes and the potential for ripple effects are much narrower. So you're getting kind of the benefits of a monolith or a microservice without having to get into the distributed computing and the fallacies of distributed computing, and all of those challenges around orchestration. And what's nice is you get some of that agility back, you get some of that deployability back. At the same time, in the future, you can start to break these pieces
Right.
up, because now I've got a package or an assembly that is my orders microservice. I just put that out there, and now I can start to independently scale that. And again, this gets to one of these and where I have a monolith and a service based and microservices and serverless. And again, you can be deliberate and choose these things correctly. Now I know we're getting close on time, and I don't know if you have anything you want to close with, Nate. I will mention one thing very briefly, that if this is a topic that you're interested in, first of all, Nate is one of the headline speakers at ArcConf. This is our this is taking place December 7th through the 10th, and it is entirely focused on software architecture. So if you are a practicing or aspiring software architect, this is definitely the place to be. And we've got some great deals going on as well. We also have our virtual workshops going on fairly regularly, and I know Nate, you appear in these from time to time, and in fact, if you subscribe to that service, you get access to some of these that we've done in the past, including Mark Richards's half day, choosing the right architecture, where he goes in depth in all of the different architectures, their pros and cons, and goes through several katas to go through that exercise of, okay, here's a problem. Which architecture would you choose? And we got a question in there. Yes, I will link some of these books as well, but yes, and then also we have the golden ticket right now, which is a very special offer just between now and the end of the year. There was 200. I know there's substantially less available now, but basically it's access to go to our conf or one of our other destination events like UberConf every single year for the next 5 years. Go to one of our tour stops every single year for the next 5 years, and get 5 years of our almost daily virtual workshops that are live, instructor led, on a variety of topics. And of course, all of these are on nofluffjuststuff.com, and you can. And this is just a sample of what's coming up in all of these, both for the conferences and for the virtual workshops. But all of that is at nofluffjuststuff.com. And so certainly that is a tremendous resource to tap into, to keep to dive deeper into the very specific topics that we've surfaced so far. But Nate, I'll hand it over to you and kind of let you give us the last words, or whatever your wisdom is.
Yeah, well, let me share a few more slides here, and just, yeah, this has been one of my soapboxes for a long time. But as technologists, regardless of what your title is, we really have to think long and hard about the pros and cons of any of the technical choices that we make. And we need to remember Uncle Ben's wise words: with great power comes great responsibility. And we need to accept that in these distributed architectures, that autonomy that we get to say you get a lot more choice, you get a lot more control. There's a flip side of that, which is accountability. And we need to be ready for that. Now, that does mean we build it, we run it, we own it. We need to understand that if we make a bad technical choice, there's probably going to be an uncomfortable conversation at some point in our future. But we have to really be cautious about the whole resume driven design approach. I mean, I'm guilty of it. We've all done it at some point or another. We need to do what's right for our projects and worry less about, this spiffy new thing we can put on our resume. So yeah, microservices do give us some very impressive benefits, but they come at a price. And it's on us to understand that we shouldn't pay that complexity tax unless we're getting something in return. So no, not everything should be a microservice. We should use them where they make sense. We should use them where they add value. Now, I didn't actually go through the principles. Sorry about that. I'll leave this as an exercise to the reader. So if you need one of the principles that we discussed kind of on and off here today around independent deployability, choosing the right technology for the job, the ability to iterate more rapidly, great, use microservices, but if not, well, there's always serverless, at least if you want to try that approach. The moral of the story here is I wish you luck. And again, be critical about your technology choices, understand the pros and cons, understand what makes sense for you, what's in the best interest of your projects, and don't get sort of forced down this path just because you saw something on Twitter or you saw some fancy white paper. You got to do what's right for you. You have to be responsible.
What a great note to wrap up on. And I just want to mention that I put some links in the chat here. So there's a link to Mark Richards and Neil Ford's Fundamentals of Software Architecture. I put a link, Nate, to your ebook on responsible microservices. And this is a great question to close the webinar with from Kratul. How do you suggest learning these architectural styles and pros and cons without messing up day job projects? What a great
Fantastic question.
If you are a designer, how do you become a better designer?
Design. If you want to be a better architect, you got to architect. My favorite way of doing this is the architectural katas. You can find those on Neil Ford's website. There we go. These are small bite-sized projects that give you just enough context that there's some meat for you to chew on, but not enough that there's any possible way that there's one obvious solution. I do this with my grad students. I've got a group of grad students right now going through an architecture course with me. I'm making them do 2 sets of katas, and it's just an opportunity to try this and do it in a way that's safe or not potentially destroying, real world project. The challenge with architecture is, you probably only really get a handful of systems in your career to architect. And so we want to make as few mistakes on the job as possible. And so by taking these little problems and kind of chewing on them, it can be super beneficial. There's so many different ways that you can use those. Even if you just get a few friends together from work or acquaintances and just spend an hour every so often just going through one and just asking each other, hey, what questions do you have about this? What would you worry about if you were the architect? What's the hard, crunchy middle of this that we have to get right? What do you think the implications would be if we use microservices for this, or event driven, or a combination approach? It can just be incredibly useful for us to think through the pros and cons, problems, et cetera. So I'm a huge fan of the katas. I use these in workshops. I use these with my grad students. So it can't recommend them highly enough.
Yeah, and the key thing is, I think as well, just finding people to participate in that process with. And I know I've linked both of our Twitters in this little view here. So you certainly reach out to us. I mean, we're this is one of the reasons that we kind of took this kind of public approach. And so to your point, Kratul, about wishing more companies would understand and allocate time for this. This is something that I'd recommend that you just spearhead. And if it's hard to get time during the workday, schedule a lunch and learn every couple of weeks, or and kind of take that approach. Just get some like-minded folks who are interested in this, and go through these exercises. Go through them together. If you've got a lot of people, break into groups and compare architectures. That's a really eye-opening exercise when you do that.
It really is.
Because all of a sudden somebody does something completely different to you, and like, why did you do that? Oh, I never thought about these things. So I would encourage that, and take some initiative to make that time, rather than waiting for somebody to allocate that time for you, because it is a part of our jobs as software architects.
Yeah, I was always very defensive of my calendar in my previous life, and I had blocks of time, and they get scheduled over sometimes, but you have to protect your schedule to a certain extent and give yourself some time to think and some time to play with these things. And that doesn't mean this has to be a monkish existence. There does need to be some work-life balance there. I think it's really easy to get burned out, especially in this environment where that sort of separation between home and work is so blurry. It can be hard sometimes to disengage, but I think it's important for us to do that from time to time. So don't be afraid to book out an hour here, an hour there, get people together, for a morning session or an afternoon session, whatever works for you. I mean, Friday afternoon tends to be a dead spot in a lot of calendars. Maybe that's when you get together with some like-minded souls and go through a kata. It doesn't have to be every week, it could be once a month, once a quarter, but there's a lot of value in just playing with that with other folks.
And one more book recommendation before we close is, as I will throw this up, Cal Newport's Deep Work, that is all about how to find that time for the deep thought and for the deep focus. But all right, well, we are out of time, folks. And once again, Nate, I want to thank you for joining us, your experience, your wisdom, and all the folks who tuned in. And yeah, check out what's going on at nofluffjuststuff.com. There are a ton of great, almost daily live events. We've got our 3 destination shows coming up here in just a couple of weeks, including ArcConf, December 7th through the 10th. And I hope to see you all there.
Have a great weekend, everybody. Cheers.
Switch it up like that. Front to the full pack, front to the back.